So once again, very warm welcome to everybody from Prague, from our recording center with the wonderful team that I have here, Zdenko, Kateřina, and Tim. And thank you for keeping with us this way. It would be much nicer to have you in person, but it is nice to see you at least in this way. So I hope you will enjoy the day today, and I will pass my words to Kateřina, who is moderating today. Bye.
Okay, welcome today at our second day of the conference. We are very happy that we gathered at least this way. And today we are having the session, which is called the second session, Patristic Inspirations. We have 3 people in the morning who are going to give their papers. First one is Father Václav Ježek, then there is Nevena Dimitrova, and Viorel Coman will respond to both papers. So firstly, I would like to ask Father Václav Ježek, who will give his speech for 20 minutes. Václav Ježek is at the faculty at University of Prešov at the Department of History, but also he is the main priest at the Cathedral Church of St. Cyril and Methodius in Prague. You can see some of his books in Czech, which he published, and he is mostly interested in Byzantine philosophy and theology. And thank you, Father Václav, that you joined us, and it's your floor at the moment.
Okay, so I'll try to give a resume of my paper here under the conditions. Of course, maybe the acoustics will not be very good, so I'm always afraid of that. So have patience with me if that's possible. So I'll read a shortened version of my paper that I presented, or I wanted to present, and we can enter the discussion later on about it, of course, as was suggested. So the present contribution is a reflection on the dynamics of the theology of the heart and love with the reference to the tradition of stillness or hesychia. The aim of this contribution is to reflect on the interesting relationship between cognition, thinking, and love, especially in the patristic tradition, which I find interesting. That is, I mean, to summarize, I'm interested in how the dynamics of thinking affects love and vice versa. I mean, that is, I think, a problem in even contemporary Orthodox theology of how to associate this emotion, love, and feeling with a noetic sort of background which is present in the Orthodox Church or theology. So this is one of my prime interests in this paper in discussing the heart in the Hesychast tradition. Perhaps especially through the prism of the Philokalia and the work of Nicodemus of the Holy Mount and the spirituality of stillness, the heart and praying gain their contemporary prominence. I think Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain has a great role in promoting the spirituality of the heart, and of course Philokalia and all these issues. But the problem is that to what extent he chose, what kind of taxonomy he used in applying the patristic tradition to these themes. That's a problem, of course, at least according to me. However, to define love and its relationship with thinking, cognition, or the nous is not so simple as it may seem. The spirituality of the heart, which is so prominent in the Orthodox tradition and prayer, can be deceptively simple and obvious at first glance. When one reads the Fathers, one can perhaps discern attention as to what to do with the heart and to love in the often brilliant noetic worlds the Fathers construct and live in. Everyone seems to agree on the importance of love and the heart, but often it is not so clear as to what is exactly the relationship, at least on the causal plane, between love and thinking. We obviously don't have the space here to go into the details and complex discussions of the position of the heart and nous in the patristic tradition, which is a complex theme, of course, but we can point to some ideas that can provide substance for further theological reflection. This is also important with reference to the biblical tradition itself. A superficial glance at the Old Testament will also show a more human or emotional emphasis on the heart and love without the necessity of linking this impulse with thought. which I think is important to emphasize, because the biblical tradition, of course, as everybody knows, had a strong influence on the development of the Syriac, even Coptic traditions, which have a more, I would say, emotional, or let's say a more complex view of the heart in terms of being devoid of the necessary Greek terminology that comes with all Greek reflection and philosophy. We also assess the basic presupposition as seen in Palamas, Gregory Palamas and others, that the nous is located in the heart. We ask ourselves, how can one describe the discerning nous and its cooperation with the heart if we are speaking essentially of one organ, which I think is a paradox, of course. It is fair to say that the heart is controlled by an external force, be it the nous or something similar. That's a question. Can the heart think it's love, or is it an organ of pure chaotic provenance under the influence of passion, which is, of course, a theme very dangerous in patristic thought. The biblical literature about the heart is complex in its own right. I'm not going to go into that, of course. One can draw attention to the concepts of the hardened heart, which Origen and even Paul had to tackle, of course. But it is important to note that the biblical literature itself has an interesting concept of gaining a new heart. I think that's important, as it seems that the human condition can be so bad that one indeed needs a new heart altogether, whatever this may mean. There are other examples where it is sufficient to heal or improve one's heart without necessarily gaining a new one. God is often portrayed as an emotional being in the Old Testament. It even has characteristics which perhaps would be viewed in the patristic tradition as unacceptable. He is full of fury, jealousy, love. Given the Philokalia, one would perhaps recommend to God to guard his own heart. Further, the human being is often in conflict with himself or herself and with God. All this can lead to the necessity of gaining a new heart, as I said. In fact, the hardened heart issue leads us to the important patristic concept of guarding one's heart so that it does not presumably become a hardened heart. Importantly, the Exodus story speaks about the fact that God knows what the Pharaoh will do in relation to the Hebrews. Here, there is a relationship between knowledge and the heart, a theme appearing elsewhere. In fact, many commentators on this story fail to realize that given the dynamics of the story, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is related to the hardened hearts of the Israelis. Israel is in bondage, has forgotten about God. Even Moses has issues of self-confidence and the ability of his fellow countrymen to release themselves. The Pharaoh appears prominent here as one with the hardened heart, but actually his hardened heart is linked to the Hebrews. The more God does to punish the Pharaoh and show his power, the same happening to the Hebrews, who thus see God's power and his love for them. And just as the Pharaoh realizes who God is, so analogously at the same time the hearts of the Hebrews are softened. In other words, the power of God shows his love and softens the heart of Hebrews and the Pharaoh. In any case, as is well known, Paul discusses the issue in Romans 9, where it is placed in the context of what we may summarize as saying, you have no control over your hearts, but God is here to proclaim his glory and chooses all. The heart, therefore, must have an open disposition to the freedom of God. It is not the heart which is free, but God is free to act on the heart, so to speak. Again, we must emphasize that Pharaoh and Hebrews are one and the same cosmos, cosmic reality. The seeming destruction of the free will of the Pharaoh is related to the free will exercised by Israel, who choose to cross to safety, so to speak. The acting God on the heart is not limited to the Old Testament canons, but the New Testament also suggests the role of the acting God on the heart. I don't want to go too much into the biblical literature here so that we can save time here, but I'm just pointing to the themes that are relevant even to the patristic understanding later on. Especially the works of Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain have brought in the impression of a complex, compact anthropological system where the heart has a seemingly clear and obvious place in the scheme of things. I think it's a deceptive position. This development coincided with a greater interest in the works of Gregory Palamas in the modern age. Perhaps a side effect of the Nicodemus popularity is that the relationship between the heart, senses, the soul, and other anthropological features is obvious, so to speak, and clear-cut. For example, in his section on the heart, in his well-known work, Handbook of Spiritual Counsel, Nicodemus immediately begins his chapter with a statement. Have you learned how to guard your external senses? Have you learned to guard also the internal and common sense of imagination? Learn now also how to guard your heart from evil passions and thoughts. It is obvious what Nicodemus means here, but the assumption immediately at the outset is that one has to have a bird's eye perspective of one's own self. How is this possible? The underlying presumption is that the human person is a fully fledged independent being, which however can be or should be observed from the outside, so to speak. In other words, if one is to guard one's heart, the senses, etc., this would entail an external observing and guarding organ outside of the person, so to speak. What if the heart and the soul are so distracted that they lose their independent quality of analysis and therefore guarding? Even biblical statements believe that the heart is beyond return. Can we imagine a situation of such utter corruption of the individual that there is a point of no return? Some fathers juggle with the notion of the utter or serious corruption of the heart, pseudo-Macarius, Messalians, and so on. Even more difficult is the next logical question. How does this external taxonomic organ know that this or that imagination is correct or not? Even more complex the situation with the heart and passions. How does one discern that a particular emotion is bad or good, when usually it is not so obvious? Perhaps at first glance, the seeming unity and relationship between the heart and other functions is not so easy to define. Even in Aristotle or Plato and other philosophers, the exact dynamics of the relationship between the heart and whose body, etc., is a difficult issue of contention. The ontological role of the heart as being the center of our communion with God is also related to these issues. The Christological implications are also important here. The external reference point of the heart is in the biblical accounts often linked with love towards one's neighbor, of course. Thus the heart knows, so to speak, because it either feels or deals not feeling something to one's neighbors. However, the monk sitting in his cell, regardless of an encounter with someone, has to discern the state of his heart. Ascetics living in an isolated lifestyle could possibly have little interaction with others and presumably could not test their heart in terms of compassion. Some biblical references refer to what we may call a reflective intellectual quality of the heart in terms of at least faith. Faith in the heart, not as an intellectual category, moves mountains, so to speak. I'm not going to quote the biblical passages, which are obvious to, I think, everyone. Generally, there is an awareness of a certain tension between what may be called a noetic turn, discussed by some modern authors, of course, and a more broader anthropological tendency in patristics. This is often demonstrated in discussions related to prayer. As is well known, there are various schools of thought, especially in relation to how one unites with God or ascends to him, how one feels his presence, and so on. The influence of Abagrius, Dionysius, and others in emphasizing the noetic perspective is often commented on by scholars. This is related to the often mute question of the exact role of the heart and its position, or the position of the nous, and so on. Perhaps an example statement on thought control is by Saint Hesychast, who is quoted in the Philokalia, where it is written, "Watchfulness is a way of embracing every virtue, every commandment. It is the heart's stillness, and when free from mental images, it is the guarding of the intellect. Just as man blind from birth does not see the sun's light, so one who fails to pursue watchfulness does not see the rich radiance of divine grace." And so on. I'm not going to continue to save time here. It confesses in the stillness of the heart, as we quote it, breathes and invokes endlessly and without ceasing only Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God and himself God. It confesses him who alone has power to forgive our sins, and with his aid it courageously faces its enemies. Through this invocation enfolded continually in Christ, who secretly divines all hearts, the soul does everything it can to keep its sweetness and its inner struggle hidden from men. The soul does everything it can to keep its sweetness and its inner struggle from men, so that the devil coming upon it surreptitiously does not lead it into evil and destroy its precious work. This is Hesychast's quotation, so to speak. In some Orthodox authors, the tension between a heart and noetic-centered spirituality is downplayed. Usually it is pointed to the works of Gregory Palamas and other later writers who provided a more inclusive and developed theology of the heart and the human being, so to speak. In any case, one would expect such a balanced theology, which would integrate both the intellect and the heart in the ascent to God. That's what we would expect, of course. The intellect seen as one controlling the heart or vice versa, or any other possibility of the predominance of one organ, seems to bring other issues into the fold. This is related to thoughts, which are governed by intellectual aspects of the human being. But the question is who and what and how are the thoughts controlled and classified if this classification is based solely on the nous intellect without recourse to presumably other factors and organs, including the heart. The greater the distance between the nous and the heart, the lesser the possibility of mutual cooperation and the dominance of the nous which results, of course. The law touching the heart could be the referential point here, which would provide for the objective formulation of one's correct decision-making process. The Syrian tradition, emphasizing the heart in the context of communion between God and man, offers a rich possibility of how to integrate the noetic emphasis with a more emotional understanding of the heart in the biblical perspective. This communion in the Syrian tradition is linked with the Eucharistic dimension, where the heart is seen as an altar being the center for communion between God and man. In St. Isaac, one has the indication of a positive attitude to thoughts, in the sense that one does not have to sort them out or get rid of them altogether in the heart, but simply has to make sure there is no evil. Thus we read purity of prayer. I'm not going to quote that again to save some time here. This kind of gazing with allowance for thought is close to the vision of Gregory of Nazianzus. Other earlier fathers of the church, such as Gregory of Nazianzus, carry in them the spirit of doubt in terms of the role of the intellect or thoughts. Gregory especially fervently attacks a theology of thoughts, drawing the attention to the inadequacies of dialectics in theology. Gregory, the theologian of contemplation, is an important regardless of his general position. I emphasize his emphasis on contemplation, which I think is absolutely strategic here. Contemplation being an important concept in Gregory of Nazianzus, and as understood by him, provides for a more passive approach to thoughts and images. For Gregory, contemplation enables one to view things as they are without necessarily a taxonomic and interactive impulse. Later, the issue of organizing thoughts and thinking gains a more pronounced role in spirituality. Without further expanding on these notions, we have to acknowledge the different types of thoughts, disconnected thoughts, images producing passion, and so on. Whatever the case, the well-known concepts of nipsis, attentiveness, sobriety, pentos, and so on, all the terms that are associated with the spirituality of the heart. In an interesting discussion bearing on our theme, Basil the Great links attentiveness with the well-being of the heart. Again, we may ask ourselves whether this observation or attentiveness does not mean introducing a theme of objectivity outside of the heart and therefore externally from the individual or personhood. In his homily on Deuteronomy 15:9, called Be Careful, Attentive, whatever we call it, or however we translate it, Basil observes that if one was without sin, one would not need to speak words. Basil expands on the idea of clarity, which stems from the purity from sin. The ancient theme of our minds and expressions being clouded by sin appears prominently here. Of course, this is so difficult for the modern reader to understand, given the fact that all is clear and understandable as long as it's logical, so to speak. The ancient spiritual tradition believed that regardless of the logic of things in rationality, especially in theology, we do not see things clearly. As Basil observes, due to the uncleanness of our lives, it is very difficult to discern the inner chambers of the heart. Just as it is difficult to communicate, so it is difficult to find truth in any word whatsoever, I mean, as an intellectual construct. The truth is built or displayed in words, even if in small amounts, by the building activity of the Holy Spirit. Needless to say, this line of thought presupposes a kind of external observation post, if we may use this term, be it the nous or anything else. It further presupposes the possibility of this external observation post to be an active force in the hearts and its improvement. In other words, the heart could be so distracted and that it needs this observation and clarity from the outside. Well, where does it come from? Of course, Basil does not expand on this notion, whether this external observation is automatically clear or objective in its own right. What if the human being is so corrupt that he or she does not have the ability to discern any wrongdoing, which is a problem in the contemporary world, where there's a relativization of sin, wrongdoing, anything that has to do with morality. Basil chooses a biblical text related to compassion, the lack of which is considered a sin. So sin is a lack of compassion from Basil, apart from other things. The biblical text is interesting in itself since it attributes sinfulness not to some action, but to a lack of compassion. Basil the Great speaks of the sins of the mind here. The text of Deuteronomy 15:9, I'm not going to quote it, well, I'll say that, I think, be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. That's what it writes. That's the quotation. The 7th year, the year for canceling debt is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among you, your fellow Israelites, and give them nothing. That is the statement from Deuteronomy, Basil quoting, which shows that sin is the lack of compassion. Basil partly answers this question by means of postulating the notion of full images in the heart. These images are produced in the heart, but could not be essentially independent in the sense of fully fledged stories, and therefore in a certain way be external to the heart. It is similar to isolated monks who no longer live in the world, but are bombarded with past experiences, which become as if entire stories and full of images of life gone, but which has no bearing or influence on the life of the monk is leading now, except of being something passing through the heart, and therefore relativized. Psychologically, one can form an entire story in his or her brain, but this can be separated as an independent image and rendered harmless. Basil speculates on the heart as the place where images are made. The images are complex and full, and therefore can produce a certain reality. He does not expand on the idea we have mentioned, that is, on the exteriorization of the internal imagery and its possible relativization. That it needs to happen is confirmed by Christ himself when speaking about the lust for a woman in the mind. If the simple thought of lust is already sin, this necessarily means that the heart has associated this thought as its own image, and therefore unites with this image, which then becomes real through the energy of the heart. Basil makes reference to Psalm 33:15. This is an interesting psalm in its own right, speaking about the heart of God and men. On all the inhabitants of the earth, he fashions their hearts individually. That's what it says. A reference to 1 Corinthians is made also. Therefore, judge nothing before the time until the Lord come, who both will bring to light the hidden things of the darkness and will make manifest the counsels of the hearts. And then shall every man have praise of God. Basil builds on the subjective aspect of the heart of every individual by suggesting that this means and coincides with the inherent subjectiveness of our perception of reality. This leads Basil to postulate an interesting observation. Basil elaborates on the fact that each organ or spiritual organ has a limited subjective view of things, that one therefore needs a complex vision of things. This is presumably offered by the heart, which can overcome the limitations of the individual organs and provide an objective insight into things. This insight equals the call to be careful. There is a reference to other biblical passages here. We have lost the ability to see things, Basil believes, that we have to gain the gift of discernment that we have lost. Our communication is not natural compared to God. There are two forms of how we can view things: through the noetic contemplation of the bodiless reality and through the senses of the corporal reality. If the body feels good, the soul does not necessarily follow the good path and vice versa. There is a little tension between the soul and body here. Either the soul feels good or the body, but perhaps not both. Basil insightfully states that one has the propensity to create fantasies, which is an important concept of the heart. These become like some dreams that can never gain reality. We thus live in non-existing realities. The more one is attentive, one gains a new and beautiful perspective of oneself. Further, the more one comprehends himself or herself, the better picture of God one gains. One can see God in himself or herself, and one does not have to trace God through contemplating the universe. The body is a means of placing the soul in a concrete place. Basil touches here on the question of the role of the body in relation to the soul, but does not expand on it. The problem of the relationship with the body, with the soul, was also a problem in ancient Greek philosophy. I'm not going to go into that, of course. Basil later reaches the conclusion in the small tractate that it is reason which helps us to guard ourselves, which I think we would all expect here. This reason is to sort out, taxify, classify that which is essentially unreasonable. I emphasize this paradox here. The reason taxifies things which are unreasonable through unreason. He states that the passion ruins reason. The passion struggles against reason. This is this negative stance to passions generally that needs to be qualified in the patristic tradition generally, I think. This brings us to conclude that reason is the objective referral point to which even the heart has to have reference. But what kind of reason is this? We can postulate here that a form of psychological point of view, our own experiences are enclosed in the sense that they cannot be repeated. From a spiritual point of view, one has to acknowledge this and move on and not be entrapped in them forever. I mean, in these thoughts that Basil talks about. Later, Hesychast theology, with its more complex development, also continued to deal with the relationship of the intellect, body, and heart, as well as other elements and spiritual organs. Gregory Palamas, as every good patristic theologian would do, stresses the goodness of the body. Palamas also had to account for the movements of the intellect and other issues which he deals with, of course.
Václav, we have like about 1 minute, right?
Okay, yeah, okay. I'll just write. I'll just finish 2 paragraphs here. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Just to comment on Palamas, the critics of Palamas from his own epoch argued that the intellect cannot return, so to speak, into the body because it is already in the body. Whereas at first glance, Palamas believes that the intellect, so to speak, has to return into the body in a spiritual process. The return of the intellect of the body is understood as a kind of renewal. The intellect wanders around and needs to be brought back. It is obvious that one immediately wonders about the dynamics of discernment and control in the spiritual sense. For example, in the Theological, except from Palamas' treatise, in the defense of those who devoutly practice life of stillness, perhaps building on Paul, this is lacking. This noetic intellectual aspect of Palamas. This is weird why Nicodemus chose not to cite this, especially if it's an introduction. This centrality of the nous is interesting, also present and taken for granted in non-canonical writings, and I'm not going to go into that to save time. Okay, so I don't have much time here. I'm sorry that it took so long. The medium is a bit limiting, so that's why I tried to summarize these things as succinctly as possible. I would conclude that the paper addresses the issue of the relationship between the heart and the nous, which I find a very interesting concept. I generally conclude, especially in reference to Gregory Palamas at the end of the paper, that even Gregory Palamas has not solved this issue completely. Why he hasn't solved this issue completely? Because I think that his emphasis does not account for the independence of the heart, especially if it's linked with a general and abstract concept of love. But I think that's just, of course, that's just an observation that can be thrown into a discussion or further reflection. So I think I can conclude with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope I was heard. I hope I was.
Yeah, you were heard. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Father Václav, for a very elaborated and very concentrated lecture on the main theme. You know, it was hard in the connection with noetic aspects. Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Nevena. Nevena is calling us from Bulgaria. She works at Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and her main life interest, as far as I know, is Saint Maximus the Confessor. We are very happy. We've been friends for ages, to be honest, and Nevena also studied here as a postdoctoral student with Ivana, so it's quite nice that there is a connection. So Nevena, please, you can start. You have 20 minutes as Father Václav.
Yes, thank you very much, Kateřina, and thank you very much to all the organizers, Ivana and team, and for everyone to let me be part of you again and to return to home in a sense. Yeah, well, my topic is about the theology of mediation of Maximus the Confessor, and it comes right after this beautiful lecture of Father Václav, which was really very intriguing. And I will continue also to build on or to refer to yesterday lectures, which were also very, very interesting, and was about Maximus, especially Telly's lecture. This topic about mediation of Maximus is kind of exists in among scholars of Maximus that this idea that he's very synthetic, let's say, he's making the synthesis of Byzantine thought. And of course, this is part of this idea of the mediative role that he has. But also, one of the first scholars on Maximus was Lars Thunberg from Sweden, who wrote his philological work on Maximus called Microcosm and Mediator, which is also based on Maximus himself, who speaks about the role of human being as the one who must reunite the fallen hypostasis of the existing world. So in Ambigua, he's speaking about the position of human being between creator and creation. So uncreated and created natures, between sensible and intelligible, between female and male. So the role of a human being is exactly this, to connect these, to mediate between these extremes of living. So I will start with this, the views of Maximus on human being as created in the image and likeness of God. As a wealth of creation and a central point between nothing and all. Here I refer to Pascal, Blaise Pascal, who says that human being is also has this position between nothing and everything, let's say, or yeah, with this mediative position. And each human being is always a being with a telos and a task. Reaching the final cause and persevering at the edge, at the boundary of existence, requires constant effort and results in the perfection of our own nature. Yet it is also an act that brings human beings closer to God. It is the means by which human beings return to the divine creator. This is why, in a more general sense, knowing human beings are those who have chosen God. To paraphrase Maximus, the knowing person aims at well-being and reaches the eternal well-being. And here I refer also to the yesterday mentioned that there is the architecture of the soul, which also can be seen in the architecture of the world outside. So this is the ontological structure of Maximus, that he says that the being is given to us by God, by God. The eternal well-being is given by grace, but well-being is something that must be achieved by the human being. As George Florovsky notes, the analogical sequence of redemptive activities is communion with God, incarnation, the constant choice of a pious life, and the incorruptibility of our corporeal nature. Resurrection. A knowing person is one who repairs the post-lapsarian tropos of human nature. The paradigm of the redemptive return to a blessed state is disclosed by God's descent and incarnation. The point of the incarnation is not just to save fallen human nature, it is also intended to fulfill the existential mission of the human creation. Furthermore, this act of descent does not occur because of the fall, but because of the indestructible unity of the divine and human natures, which gives rise to the entrance of life in the created being. In the Ambigua, human beings are given the mission to mediate between the different components of their own nature and are portrayed as realizing universal coherence or perichoresis only through life in Christ. The key to accomplishing this task is rooted in the fact that human nature is created in the image of God and involves the process of likening to God by making use of the particular inclinations inherent in the gnomic will and choice. The dichotomous dyad of image and likeness not only plays an important role in Maximus' thought, it constitutes the foundation of the entire corpus of patristic literature. It has its origin in Genesis 1:26 and is of central concern to the Alexandrian tradition, Cappadocian Fathers, and origin. The main issues raised by this perspective include the definition of the image, or more precisely, of the nature that has been created in the image, the connection between the divine and human realms, and the way the human mind, will, and body work together during the process of growing toward God's likeness. In most of the Church Fathers' writings, the Imago Dei is associated with the mind. In the Alexandrian tradition, the created image is related to the soul alone. Already in Philo's work, only the highest part of the soul, the nous, is regarded as the image of God. Modifying this view, the Cappadocian Fathers consider the human being's entire constitution of soul and body to be the image of God. Maximus does not identify only the mind or the soul as the Imago Dei. He views the whole human being as being the image of the perfect creator. Thus, the creator's task is to acquire similarity to the creator. The image is primarily related to nous, while the likeness is more closely related to logos. The relationship between image and likeness in Maximus' teachings should be looked at in terms of the distinction between nature and hypostasis that can also be found in Cappadocian texts. Yet another pair of concepts which raise this issue, namely the logos of essence and tropos of existence, is of more interest in this context. It is said that nature is in line with the image and logos, while the hypostasis corresponds to likeness as a mode of existence. The relation between image and likeness could thus be regarded as consisting of three dyads and two triads. On the one hand, connections are made between image and likeness, nature and hypostasis, logos and tropos, and on the other hand, beginning, middle, end, being, well-being, internal well-being are grouped together. The image of God corresponds to the essence or nature of human beings. Hence, the core of this nature consists of qualities, attributes, and faculties bestowed by divine grace. Maximus defines these as divine attributes that have been ascribed to human nature or as images of the divine essence. Insofar as the image of God is the logos of human beings, it possesses all of the essential characteristics of human nature, but it also includes that which is ideal, whose potency is in keeping with God's will and should be regarded as the telos of human existence. This enables human beings to achieve the middle position between that which is given at the beginning and the acquired end. Maximus contexts these views in a well-established tradition in which the paradigm or archetype of the image is the divine logos. All of the logi of created things have their beginning and end in the logos. Likeness to God is not applicable to human nature like the images. Instead, it pertains to the hypostasis. While the image of God is part of human beings, nature, constitution, and is given by the Creator without any effort on the part of its human recipients. Achieving the divine likeness entails personal participation and, in this sense, is related to the human disposition to will and choose. While the divine image reveals the logos of human nature, the likeness reveals a mode of existence. This likeness is composed of the virtues of goodness and wisdom, which are qualities that Maximus discusses in chapters on love. Goodness corresponds to virtue, and wisdom corresponds to knowledge, to praxis and theoria. The relations mentioned above reveal that Maximus associates being and eternal well-being with the divine image, while likeness is linked to well-being. Although God possesses these qualities and virtues by nature, human beings must acquire them through participation. In this respect, possession of the image of God is natural or by default, while likeness is a fruit of becoming. In Ambigua 41, Maximus concludes that although human beings were made in the image of God, they attain likeness to God only by virtue of the divine grace, free will, and by observing the commandments. Pursuing a virtuous life makes it possible for human beings to become imitators of God in accordance with the predispositions of their own desires and volitions. Maximus' understanding of human beings is integrally related to his perception that actualizing the virtues is a dynamic process which inaugurates a renewed tropos of human existence and a new habitus. Virtue is not once and forever acquired state. Rather, it is a process in which the will and the whole body soul composite follow their inclination toward Christ, who is hypostasis virtue per se. This process constitutes an everlasting path to perfection. Knowing and loving God is a journey to be traveled eternally. Maximus even describes the virtues as the potential content of human beings, God-given nature, insofar as each person actualizes these in similarity or likeness by means of his or her own effort. As Evagrius already defines it, practical virtues are the flesh of Christ, natural contemplation the blood of Christ, and knowledge of God is the heart of Christ. Actually, what Maximus later would inherit and formulate specifically would be that both knowledge and virtues imply the birth of logos in the heart. And here I just wanted to refer the topic to the topic of the conference about the heart. I was looking at the, it was interesting to hear yesterday's lecture that that it would be nice to have the structure, the architecture of the soul seen in the architecture of the world outside. It was interesting to see that in ancient thought, in ancient philosophy tradition, the whole universe was a living being. So everything was considered to be connected with one to another. In this sense, also for Aristotle, for example, the heart is both the thinking subject and the place for our emotions. So everything actually is concentrated in the heart, and the brain, according to Aristotle, is the refrigerator of the body, let's say, because its function was also only to cool the blood. So that was how it was seen in this ancient thought. So everything was concentrated in the heart. And later I will refer this also to the lecture that we were listening by now, Father Václav, that actually nous was the thinking process was also kind of happening in the heart. This will to connect noetic with sensible, which is part of human mediative function, was happening also in the heart for Maximus. So I was looking to the history of the idea of the heart. Here I just was looking to Aristotle, Avicenna, and their actually medical description of this organ. And then Evagrius, who says that out of the soul's purification is the essential first step, not the end of the spiritual path. Out of apatheia comes love. Agape is the progeny of apatheia. The goal of the ascetic life is charity. When the ascetic soul is passionless, one can see the true value of each person and love others because they are created in the image of God. Evagrius writes, it is not possible to love all the brethren to the same degree, but it is possible to associate with all in a manner that is above passion, that is to say, free of resentment and hatred. Love for one's neighbor results from ascetic discipline and is the door to the next most spiritually significant stage of spirituality, gnostike. Only through love, knowledge becomes possible. Here I found this idea of purity of heart, that it actually has at least the following dimensions in a person's interior life and external behavior. It can be seen in thoughts, motives, desires, dispositions, emotions, decisions, and actions. Some recent essays seem to suggest that developing purity of heart leads for each person to his or her real self as the point of meeting between God and the human person. Achieving purity of heart can be thought of as regaining a mature innocence. I like this idea of mature innocence. That is the purity of heart. Maximus uses the word for heart 27 times in his works. Of main importance is his emphasis, or rather definition, that he gives of heart as a purified mind, which is in a kind of in tradition, but of course here it is not meant purified mind as only forgetting all the stages until reaching this stage, but including everything that we have experienced in the previous stages of the practice of the soul. So it is kind of opposed to some Stoic or even Evagrius positions. In chapters on knowledge, Maximus again deals with the concept of heart as the place of God where there is no natural movement, but only simplicity. This is the place where prayer of the heart leads, and the pulsing of the heart becomes both the disconnect from the worldly matters and the connection to everything in deification. The status of humanity in Maximus' theology is not fixed, but rather given the opportunity to attain its perfection. Being the mediator between created and non-created, between sensible and intelligible, male and female, human being is the mediator, giver and receiver of divine qualities and love. This happens only in the prepared, through practiced heart. Love is a gift as a divine quality, but love is also a constant work that would allow its manifestation and share with others. Learning how to love, in the words of Professor Papanicolaou, the meaning of the other in the theology of Metropolitan Bishop of Pergamon John Zizioulas, the theology of Father Andrew Lawton, Maximus the Confessor, and Thomas Aquinas, Ecumenical Institute in Prague with Professor Ivana Noble. All of them are the exemplar of such great theology.
Nevena, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You have like about 3 minutes, right? 3 minutes.
I'm finishing.
Perfect.
All of them are the example of such great theologizing that builds bridges and demonstrates how we can be pulsing together in one rhythm. So let me finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nevena. Sorry, I interrupted you. Thank you very much. I tried with the numbers, but it didn't work. So now it's time for a response by Viorel Coman. Are you there, Viorel? Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Hello to Belgium.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello to everyone. So good morning, everyone.
Yeah, Viorel, wait a minute. We will put a slide about you just for people to get known who you are. As Viorel, he's in Belgium. Now at the moment is a senior postdoctoral fellow at the university at Leuven, Catholic University, and also the secretary of the Societas Ecumenical. You can see some of these books about Dimitrova and others, and his research interest, 20th century Orthodox theology, Trinitarian theology, pneumatology, ecclesiology, and ecumenism. Viorel, you can respond to our 2 papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So good morning, everyone. First of all, allow me to express my gratitude to the organizers of this conference for the kind invitation to participate in this academic event and to prepare a short response to the papers of Nevena and Václav. Since a conference is an event where knowledge is shared and discussed, I'm also thankful to all the participants in the conference for offering me the opportunity to learn from and be enriched by their excellent presentations. Even though due to the current pandemic crisis it's not possible to meet face-to-face this year as initially scheduled, the meeting in a virtual form still allows us to stay connected and engage with one another in a way that is still fruitful to all of us. I will start my response with some general remarks about the two papers and their common theme, and only then I will move to a few concrete aspects and questions. So the papers of Nevena and Václav introduced us to the patristic approaches to the main theme of our conference, which revolves around the anthropological question of the place of the heart in the so-called heartless world. Both Nevena and Václav did an excellent work in trying to identify how patristic voices had coped with the question of what is central in human life. The Orthodox Metropolitan Callistos Ware once said that ecclesiology was the main theological topic of the past century. Even though the doctrine of the church did not lose its relevance today due to the evolution of our societies and the many problems associated with it, globalization, urbanization, migration, technological progress, biomedical issues, etc., the 21st century must operate a shift in the central focus of theological inquiry from ecclesiology to anthropology. So according to Metropolitan Callistos, what is the human person needs to be, in fact, the major question to be answered today by theology and all other human sciences, individually, but also in dialogue to one another. Theology needs to learn from secular disciplines in terms of anthropology as much as secular disciplines need to learn from theology. What the paper of Nevena and Václav made clear to us is that theology should not start the reflective process on anthropology and its associated questions from scratch. Patristic theology, which is the accumulated wisdom of the church under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is of much help for us today. While it is true that some anthropological claims of patristic inspiration might no longer be normative for our contemporary world, as they were framed by a different cultural context and mindset, some other patristic insights can guide us throughout this process of reflecting anew on what it means to be a human person situated within and across the life course, as well as on the question what is central to human life. After reading the papers of Nevena and Václav, which are very much connected to one another, I can already emphasize three general remarks about the contemporary relevance of their themes. The first remark refers to the theological content of their papers. The second remark deals with methodology. And the third one identifies a further task for contemporary theologians in connection to patristic insights. So in terms of theological content, some important ideas emerge out of the presentation of Nevena and Václav. First of all, it is clear that according to Maximus the Confessor and the tradition that followed, including the Hesychast spirituality, the entire human being, soul, mind, and body, is the image of the creator, as Nevena already emphasized, and I quote her. Maximus does not identify only the mind or the soul as the imago Dei. He views the whole human being as the image of the perfect creator. End of quotation. Václav's reference to the struggle of patristic theology represented by the Cappadocian fathers, Maximus the Confessor and others, to keep together mind and heart. This is on the one hand, the rational, intellectual and speculative dimension of the human person, very much emphasized by the intellectual mysticism of Clement of Alexandria, Origen and Evagrius, and on the other hand, the mystical so-called materialism of the Messalians, which claim that God can be perceived through carnal senses, is also an example of the patristic quest for human wholeness. With the risk of some generalization, for patristic theology, the human person is an intellectual, psychological, emotional, physical, sexual, spiritual, and aesthetical existence. What does this mean? It means, according to me, that when one of these many dimensions of the human existence is neglected, suppressed, or silenced, the human person is alienated or handicapped. Moreover, it means that there is no discipline alone that can offer of a comprehensive definition of the image of the human person, but all of them together in dialogue, theology, psychology, arts, anthropological sociology, etc., might come closer to the mystery of the human person. When we are practicing sports, when we are creating works of art, when we are interacting with the world around us, etc., these activities tell us something about the image and the likeness of God in us, about the place and the vocation of the human being in creation. Secondly, the two papers that I have been asked to respond to stress the fact that in the post-lapsarian stage of existence, the human person is a sort of mediator, someone who has received the noble task of bringing together or restoring the communion between different inner and external elements torn apart by sin. The human person, according to Nevena, is supposed to heal the inner tensions that structure his or her life, mind versus heart, body versus soul, etc. The divisions between the human component of the cosmos and the rest of creation, as well as between the whole cosmos and God. In this sense, patristic tradition refers to the human person as a priest who deifies the whole of creation and returns it to the creator. As a matter of fact, the human person is not a solitary existence, simply and egoistically preoccupied with how to overcome the fracture between mind and heart. But the human person is very much defined in relation to other human beings and the rest of creation. So even when spirituality seems to acquire a very individualistic dimension, the spiritual progress of the human person cannot be detached from creation and the human fellows. A second general remark in terms of methodology. In terms of theological methodology, the two papers show that patristic authors did not have ready-made answers to questions related to theology, spirituality, and anthropology. Patristic authors exemplify the fact that theology is a continuous and laborious process of reflection and exploration. Sometimes the sources from the past help. Other times the questions that theology confronts are completely new and necessitate adequate answers. Sometimes the results of their theological work had become the normative teachings of the church, as in the case of the Cappadocians, Maximus, the Confessors, and so on. Other times their outcomes had not received the official approval of the church, as in the case of Origen mysticism and his disciples. Nevertheless, a synthesis between extremes is always necessary, as it happens when the elements of an intellectual mysticism are harmonized with those of a more sense-based mysticism. However, it is also important to listen to the so-called extreme positions as a safe way to make sure that none of the elements of the synthesis, either the more intellectual ones or the more sensorial ones, are silenced and neglected in the harmonious whole. For example, to revisit Origen spirituality with its emphasis on intellectual mysticism is beneficial, in the sense that it reminds us always of the importance of cognition and reflection in any theological act. Otherwise, theology will become sentimental, pious, and romantic. The vice versa is also true. Without the emphasis on the lived dimension of Christianity, on spiritual experience, theology will become dry and over-rational, driven solely by speculative concern. The third general remark in terms of a further task for theology. After reading the two papers, what I still consider to be the major task of contemporary theology is the work of translation. I do not refer to the translation of the patristic corpus from Greek or Latin into our modern language, even though this is automatically implied. I refer to the fact that theological notions of patristic origin, specialized term, and church vocabulary are no longer understood by modern people, and they need to be translated or explained into the language of our human fellows who do not share with us the long benches in the church, to people who have no familiarity with theology and its universe, in a world to secular people. What elements and aspects from the experience of modern human beings will correspond to patristic notions such as heart, image, likeness, mediator, ousia, hypostasis, tropos, hesychast, nous, apatia, grace, and so on. And as an example, very often theologians try to translate the theological notion of grace by making use of human feelings of codependence, of the fact that we are dependent upon one another. And this might offer somehow to the modern person a glimpse into the meaning encapsulated by the church in the theological term of grace, for example. The experience of grace is explained as co-responsibility. Even though I prefer to associate grace with freedom rather than codependence, I appreciate the effort behind this work of translation that liberates theology from its ivory tower and disconnection from everyday life and from modern patterns of thinking. Just to make clear, this is not a criticism of the two presentations, as their main task was to present the patristic views of the concept of heart and mediation. My remarks are rather intended to emphasize the urgent task that lies ahead of us, but I'm pretty sure that some of the next presentations at this conference will do justice to this. Theology is therefore a work in progress, and it will always be this way. I will now move to more concrete remarks related to the ideas put forth by Nevena and Václav. Even though some of these remarks are formulated under the form of a question, I'm perfectly aware that the answer to these questions is an open one, which will need serious further reflections. In this sense, I have two concrete remarks or questions. The first remark can be addressed to both Nevena and Václav, and the second remark is related to Nevena's presentation. My first remark refers to the place of people with severe disabilities within a patristic theology of the human person as a mediator. Even though patristic authors did not engage seriously with this type of question, this is an urgent theological task for us today. How would a person with intellectual or other type of disabilities who does not respond in any way to external stimuli could be still understood and seen as a mediator between creation and the creator? What would be the relationship between cognition and love in the case of these people? Or how could she or he still attain the goal of human existence as stressed by Maximus' theology? And I quote from Nevena's paper. Maximus concludes that although human beings were made in the image of God, they attain likeness to God only by virtue of the divine grace, free will, and by observing the commandments. Pursuing a virtuous life makes it possible for human beings to become imitators of God in accordance with the predispositions of their own will and volition. End of quotation. Would this theology that emphasizes the dynamic contribution of the human being be inclusive enough as to offer a theology of theosis that does not exclude human with severe intellectual disabilities? What would natural contemplation mean for these people? Or, I quote, the birth of logi in their heart. End of quotation. I'm not a specialist on this topic and do not pretend to have answers to these questions. My very good friend and colleague from Louvain-la-Neuve, Petre Maican, is better suited to raise and answer them. However, I simply wanted to bring this subject into discussion because it's important to reflect theologically in relation to the full spectrum of human existence, which includes disabled people, from whom a theology of divine image and likeness is far from being articulated as to include them in the best possible way. I'm of the opinion that we have to rethink patristic categories in order to answer anthropological questions from the perspective of intellectual disability, especially when the progress from image to likeness is dependent upon cognition, freedom, cooperation, constant effort. What would be, if any, the contribution of Hesychast tradition to this sort of modern questions? What Maximus' theology of mediation could contribute to these debates? As I said, these are open questions, and I do not claim to have myself an answer at this moment. The second remark, and the last one, which refers to Nevena's presentation, is also of a more ethical dimension. At some point in the presentation that I have received 2 weeks ago, Nevena mentioned that according to Maximus, the patristic concept of nature, ousia, would correspond to the concept of image, while hypostasis corresponds to likeness as a mode of existence. Perhaps this is also the case in Ziziula's reading of the Cappadocians in Maximus the Confessor. However, I'm not calling into question whether Metropolitan Ziziula's reading is correct or not. Let's assume it is. The problem that I see is the following. If personhood as likeness is not given to all of us, but it is something that some of us might receive at the end of a long and dynamic process, it means that some people are less persons than others. To me, this raises a lot of ethical questions, especially because it could lead to different forms of discrimination and marginalization. If some of us are less persons, they can be manipulated, discriminated, and so on. Maybe I'm exaggerating a bit the consequences of such approach, but this exaggeration is meant to shed better light on the negative implications of this distinction when its interpretation is pushed to the extreme. At the end of my response, I would like to express once again my appreciation to Nevena and Václav for their very interesting presentations, which offered all of us food for thought. I'm looking forward to the discussions, and if there is enough time, to your reaction to my remarks. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Viorel, for your profound answer, response to both papers. If we don't have a lot of time because we started a little bit late, so we have 15 to 20 minutes. But firstly, I would like to ask Father Václav and Nevena if shortly they can react shortly to your response. So who is first? Nevena wants to react, or Nevena? Okay, and then
I don't know, maybe whatever you say.
Yeah, Nevena, you can start. You can react.
Okay, thank you. I'm extremely grateful for this response. It was really, really nice, and I like the whole perspective in which it was put. Like I like the construction as a whole, and all the details also that were mentioned by Viorel. So really, thank you. To me, what you mentioned about the translation in the beginning, it kind of marks all the questions that you asked later on. First of all, I would like to express the gratitude that the modern world has to Romania for Father Staniloae, who was the first translator of Maximus in modern languages. Until him, we had Maximus only in Greek and Latin. So he was the first who translated Maximus in modern languages. To this, I would say that what you mentioned about how we deal with questions in theology is how we understand the terms that were used by fathers. And yes, we speak about ousia, hypostasis, tropos, logos, I would like to emphasize more on the beginning of your presentation, that we have to look at the fathers as a whole, so that there was a recent project of making a dictionary of Maximus, which I find a little bit strange, to be honest. I mean, it depends on the dictionary, because we cannot speak about fathers and what they understand in these terms so radically. Like, for example, at one point, Maximus uses logos in one sense, and the other text he uses in another sense. So if we don't have the perspective of his theology as a whole, we cannot just alienate these words and speak about them just like that. But still, when we are together here as specialists in this field, we can, I think, make references the way we do. For example, when I said about Maximus' understanding of free will, and the fact that acquiring well-being depends on human own efforts, of course, it does include everyone, but it's really difficult to I mean, of course, I cannot answer for him, but how to include disabled people, or even how to define human being when it's not the thinking capacity, or it's not the feeling capacity, and with disabled people, we don't exclude them, but we have to define love for them maybe in another sense. So maybe the question is what we define as love for one another, so that they are included. And also, just one more reference, because I was asked the question.
Nevena, thank you.
Just one thing, please.
Fun.
It was on the conference in Prague, some of the previous years, and I was asked the question, what would Maximus say about LGBT, and I remembered there was Pope Francis who was saying that he was traveling in an airplane, and next to him there was a guy who was like this, and he asked for his blessing, and the Pope Francis said, "Who am I to judge him?" So I don't know if we exclude these people. They are included. We have to change probably our point of understanding, really, not the terms, but the entire perspective of this theology.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nevena. Sorry, I'm the strict one here today. So, Father Václav, can you hear us? Do you want to react? Father Václav?
I think I can hear it, but I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's a bit okay. I don't know. I can just say two general observations. I don't want to delay the time. I mean, generally with the human beings with disability, I think I can answer in a more spiritual sense that you know, when I was living in a monastery for a while on Mount Athos, even though I was completely healthy, I didn't have any issues, illnesses, or anything like that. I still realized that I'm missing something that other people had that were spiritual beings, so to speak. So I don't think disabilities is a separate category. I think a disability, we do not know how are we in what presence are we with God. I mean, I can be perfectly healthy, I can have sight, I can have intellectual capacity, but that doesn't mean that I am a loving or in the presence of God. So this means that a disabled person, we don't know how he thinks or she thinks or what's going on in his head. But the problem is, what is the presence of him in front of God? And this presence is related to the other beings. It's related to let's say, the Eucharistic dimension, where everybody is incorporated into this presence through somebody else, which is it's a good point that was said by Viorel, that there are some problems with Zizioulas's theology on the personhood, in the sense that if he relates the category of the person only to relationships and its building, could be a problem. But the problem is that we have to realize the patristic tendency to say that none of us are really healthy people, even mentally or physically, unless we are in the presence or in love with God. So the question is relative. I mean, of course, I do not know how a disabled person mentally operates in his cognition, but the problem is that I know how I can relate to him, and the feeling that he has from me as being together with me is the thing that is important for him to feel the presence of God. That is important for him. He doesn't have to have an intellectual capacity for that. So I think the inclusiveness of disabled people is present in an Eucharistic, or whatever we call it, theology, especially the Orthodox tradition, where everybody is incorporated. But the relative question is, are we all healthy, even though we are healthy in this sense? So I had that feeling when I was in various situations where I distinctively felt that people who had some sort of a disability. I will give you a small example. When I was in Ethiopia, I met a blind priest that had other problems and issues and physical deformities, and he was very ill. I don't know what else he had. He was very sick, and I felt that this guy is more happy, is in more presence than me. So I wouldn't sharply distinguish between disability and non-disability in the theological sense.
Thank you very much, Father Václav. And so now there's floor for your questions. You can just write in chat, I have a question, and we will call you. Okay, we have like 15 minutes because then there is a break for coffee.
You don't speak chat?
What?
You can write in chat.
No. Yeah, it's better in English, okay, that you have a question, please. Yeah, there are some questions, and then there will be Ivana. Yes, so Yorgos, can you hear us?
Yes, good morning once again, and many thanks for the excellent presentations. My question is directed to Father Václav, but I think that also the others could say something like that. And it's about the relation between heart and law. Modern theologians comment on the so-called Nicodemean paradox. Saint Nicodemus of Mount Athos is the editor both of the Philokalia and the Rudder, the Pidalion, this connection and interpretation of the canons of the church. And many theologians find a tension between this heart-centered hesychastic tradition and a really conservative and legalistic approach of the canons of the church. And this is something we don't only find in Nicodemus, but also in many persons who are pleading for hesychasm in the nowadays. In the most fervent theorists of hesychasm are also persons who have many really fundamentalistic approaches considering theology. And so I would like to ask very directly, is this legalism a kind of hidden agenda of hesychasm? What's the relation between this theology of the heart and the importance of the law? And of course, the question is, what is the relation between reason, law, and heart? Is law ex definitio heartless? Is it closer to reason? Nevena mentioned what Pope Francis said, who am I that will judge? But Francis does also not question the doctrine of his church. He does not question the canon law of his church. So what is the question? What is the connection beyond the pastoral level?
Thank you very much, Yorgos. And now Václav and Nevena, please, if you want to react, who of you?
Oh, Nevena can start.
Nevena.
No, yeah, I think it
Should I
was
start?
no, because it was towards you. I think.
Yeah, yeah. So
yes,
You
sure,
almost
I
said
do
that
know.
it's for Father Václav first, because, but if you want me to.
yeah, so
Well, to respond to this, I think it's a very good question. It's a very good question, and it basically also relates to what I was trying to say in my paper in a way, because I personally have a huge problem with Nicodemus's summarizations of Orthodox theology, which I think is very paradoxical, because in one way he suggests a great liberation in terms of spirituality in his writings that he quotes from the fathers, but at the same time he limits this into a certain system that he develops also according to patristic authors, but this creates a weird tension that perhaps is even also translates itself into his own writings. I think that is a valid point. But the problem with the hesychasm, I think the problem is not with hesychasm and the law as such. I think the problem is how people adopt a hesychast theological framework and understand it as applied to everyday, let's say, ecclesial life or action. That is the problem. And the problem is that the Orthodox have not developed, if there is any, an exegetical or spiritual method of applying that and saying this is how it should be operated. This is, and I'm saying that also from a personal experience, because I remember when I was studying theology in Australia, for example, I'll give an example. And I was studying at a Greek Orthodox Theological College. We were all reading the Philokalia very adamantly, but when we had to apply it to everyday life in Australia at that time, in a secular society, and especially with all the challenges that we felt, it was an impossible task, which created a lot of stress and I don't know, a lot of problems, not only in the parish and the people and everybody involved, but I mean generally there was this tendency to see this. And the other third thing perhaps to say is that the Orthodox canon law, I'm the first one which would say that I think any Orthodox that starts to develop canon law is not Orthodox anymore. Not in the sense that canon law is bad and that it describes things, but the problem is that what kind of methodology and hermeneutics do you apply when you develop a canon law, especially if you link it to spiritual issues? And that's what I think that is a problem. For example, to end my point, I think there was a huge problem in Nicodemus when there was this COVID crisis discussions about the Eucharist. And I think one of the examples is how somebody quoted Nicodemus' Spidalion in discussing the Eucharist. And a weird thing is that he suggests a certain method in offering Holy Communion, which would be let's say a hygienic method that he adopts, which is completely strange if you compare it to how he portrays himself for the theologian. I mean, if you adapt that kind of legalistic understanding, it doesn't go well with how you broadly view spiritual issues and the heart that he discusses in the same works, in the same spiritual summaries that he offers. So I think that would be my response here.
thank you very much. I agreed. And probably one more question from Ivana.
Yeah, thank you very much for all three presentations. I will go back to Viorel's, I will go back to Viorel's last point about the full humanity and the distinction between between image and likeness of God. I think that there are two hermeneutical principles which can be in use. One, when you want to do the discrimination, and I think that there it is really problematic. But if you unite the image and likeness, which some of the church fathers also did, but there was a minority of them, then you lose the power of becoming. And what I really liked when Father Václav responded to the question about the handicapped people and I think the understanding that we are not yet fully there, none of us, is really vitally important, because this allows us to grow. But the growth is not a discriminative category. It's not the question, you are not there yet. It's about me, I am not there yet, this kind of recognition. And I think the identification of the two concepts doesn't allow that. Perhaps we need to keep them in the antinomic relationship, where both is valid 100% rather than half and half. Just a comment. You can comment on it if you wish. Thank you.
So do you want to comment, Václav or Nevena?
Or Viorel.
Or Viorel, sorry. Can you hear us?
Maybe
Mhm.
yes, yes. Maybe Nevena Viorel can say something so that I don't speak all the time.
Well,
Maybe a brief remark. I also agree with what Václav said, that we all are disabled people. But if we say this, I also think that we run the risk to yeah, I think what we are doing is we are emphasizing the importance of this disability for the people who are, for instance, have this kind of intellectual problems. Of course, we all have this kind of issues. We all are not full human beings, but I think that when we say this, I think we really undermine the reality of this disability, especially for those kind of people who have intellectual problems. I don't know if that's clear what I want to say.
Thank you. And Václav or Nevena? Nevena, do you? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe just to add to that, maybe this redefining love is really important. Well, if we have to do it into words, but also what Yorgo said about the legalistic side of it. I don't know. It's really strange. I remember one like a jury said, not jury, but a judge said that the law is just it marks the some, how to say, term, but how you will walk there is the matter of how you deal with a living thing. So this would be like tradition and innovation in a sense, and how you do with this. So yeah.
What I can also add about this relationship between love and law in the Hesychast tradition is the fact that, for instance, Hesychast spirituality has also its own rules and laws. For instance, the prayer of Jesus Christ, you have to say it in a certain way. There is also a technique. Maybe this, the presence of a technique and together with the experience of grace, it's a sort of combination between love, spirituality, and the existence of norms and rules. So maybe we can start from here somehow.
Yeah, and it's not useful to make like a boxing match, to have anthropology on one side, ontology on the other side. This is the meaning of this, to make it to make the complexity, to make it together, and really to realize how it works.
Thank you. Father Václav, if you want.
I will just, all the observations were correct. I think meaningful. I just want to add maybe to the disability issue one particular I don't know, a pastoral example that I experienced not long ago, where there was a human being, a man was lying in a coma, where the doctors and all the specialists said that this guy or this man is not conscious, he's not feeling anything, he's completely on a different planet, so to speak. and there was no way we could interact with this person lying on the bed who was in this coma. We were just looking at him. He was somewhere on of course, in a different mode of thinking, whatever we call it. And the only thing that the connection that we could have between me and or this person with the coma was that I touched him, and I said a prayer. And when I said a prayer and I touched him, I saw that his breathing and his bodily functions were changing, and I had this feeling that I see a smile there. So I think this dimension of interaction and human love is one way that we can understand perhaps how people who are disabled or in comas or any other similar situations can feel or be part or integrated into the whole of let's say humanity or our community.
Thank you very much. I see there are no questions or nobody asked to ask a question. I'm very sorry that I have to end up this session because it was really beautiful. Thank you very much.